The day Amara signed the marriage papers, the entire neighborhood laughed at her. Not the cruel kind of laughter that wants to wound. The tired, disbelieving kind. The laughter of people who have seen enough hardship to know exactly how this story was supposed to end and exactly how much it was going to cost her to find out. She was 29, working 2 jobs and living in a modest apartment she had inherited from her late mother. It wasn't much. A narrow bedroom with a window that stuck in the summer. A kitchen so small that 2 people couldn't stand in it at once without brushing shoulders. A balcony. The one good thing about the place that overlooked the old Maple Crest Estate. The estate was famous in the city, the kind of place people pointed out to their children from moving cars. It stretched across acres of manicured land, white stone mansions half hidden behind rows of maple trees, private gardens that bloomed in colors. No ordinary garden bloomed in, fountains that ran even when no one was watching them, and iron security gates that ordinary people were only ever allowed to admire from a distance, never to pass through. Amara had grown up on that balcony. As a girl, she used to lean over the rail and imagine the lives of the people who lived behind those gates. Imagine dinners lit by chandeliers. Imagine rooms so large a person could get lost in them. It was a harmless kind of dreaming, the kind that costs nothing and changes nothing. And by the time she was 29, she had mostly stopped doing it. Dreaming took energy she didn't have left after double shifts at the hospital. The man she married had nothing. His name was Daniel. He had no car, no family nearby, no visible income, and as far as anyone in the neighborhood could tell, no place to sleep. People called him a drifter. Some said he'd been sleeping in the abandoned building near the estate's old service entrance. Others claimed he'd lost everything in a failed business, that he'd once worn suits and now wore whatever the shelter donation bins gave him. No one really knew the truth. Daniel never offered it, and something about the stillness in his eyes discouraged people from asking twice. Amara met him during a heavy rainstorm, the kind that turns gutters into rivers and sends everyone running for cover except the people who have nowhere to run to. She had just finished a late shift at the hospital, 12 hours on her feet, 3 codes called, 1 patient she couldn't save, when she saw him sitting on a broken bench near the bus stop, completely soaked through. Most people walked past him without a second glance. Rain has a way of making everyone selfish. It narrows the world down to the 6 feet in front of your own umbrella. Amara stopped. "Are you all right?" she asked. Daniel looked up with tired eyes and improbably smiled. Not the practiced smile of someone asking for money, something quieter. "I'm fine," he said, "just waiting for the rain to stop." She noticed he had no umbrella, no bag, no jacket heavier than the thin one already plastered to his shoulders. Nowhere to go, and no urgency about getting there. That night she bought him a meal from the noodle cart on the corner and didn't ask him a single question while he ate it, because 12 years of nursing had taught her that hungry people don't want interrogation. They want food and 5 minutes of being left alone. The next day, on her way to work, she found him in the same place. A week later, she learned from the volunteer coordinator at the downtown shelter, a woman she knew from her hospital rounds, that the shelter was full, had been full for a month, and that Daniel had been turned away 3 times. She wanted to help, but her apartment building had strict rules. No unrelated male tenants, no exceptions. A clause the landlord enforced like scripture ever since a previous tenant had caused trouble 2 years back. There was only one legal way he could stay with her. Everyone told her it was a terrible idea. "Don't ruin your life for a stranger," her co-worker Ifeoma warned her over lunch, setting her fork down hard enough to make the point. "He's using you," said her landlord, not even bothering to lower his voice as Daniel stood 3 feet away, carrying in the 1 box of belongings he owned. "You'll regret this," said her aunt, the closest thing to a mother Amara had left, over a phone call that ended with both of them in tears. But Amara had spent years caring for abandoned patients, forgotten widows, and homeless children who came through the ER with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Compassion was the one thing about her that had never worn down, no matter how many double shifts tried to grind it out of her. If anything, the hospital had taught her that the difference between a stranger and a person you love is sometimes nothing more than a little time and a little proximity. So she made an impossible decision. She married Daniel in a quiet civil ceremony with only 2 witnesses present, Ifeoma still shaking her head, and an elderly court clerk who had seen every kind of marriage this city had to offer, and no longer blinked at any of them. There was no wedding dress, no reception, no honeymoon. Just a signature, a plain silver ring bought from a small jewelry shop near the courthouse, and a quiet promise spoken only between the two of them that this was shelter, nothing more, a roof over his head until he found his feet again. For the first few weeks, Daniel was the perfect guest. He cooked breakfast before she woke, learning quickly that she liked her eggs a certain way without ever being told twice. He cleaned the apartment until it gleamed in a way it hadn't since her mother was alive. He fixed the leaking kitchen sink with tools he seemed to produce out of nowhere, without being asked, without making a show of it. He never complained about sleeping on the old lumpy couch, though Amara sometimes woke at 3 in the morning to find him still awake, sitting upright, staring at nothing. When she came home exhausted from 12-hour shifts, she would often find dinner already made, still warm, waiting under a plate on the stove. He was kind, respectful, quiet in a way that felt less like emptiness and more like a man carrying something he'd decided not to set down in front of her yet. But there was one thing that never made sense. Every evening, without fail, Daniel would step out onto the balcony and stare across the road at the massive Maple Crest Estate. Its lit windows, its gates, its long gravel drives disappearing into darkness. Not with envy. Amara knew what envy looked like. She'd seen it on her own face reflected in that same glass as a child. This was different. This was familiarity. Sometimes he would smile faintly at something only he could see. Sometimes he would shake his head slowly, like a man remembering a life that no longer quite belonged to him. One evening, half joking, she leaned against the balcony rail beside him and said, "You look at that estate like you own it." Daniel didn't laugh the way she expected. He just smiled, that same gentle, unreadable smile, and said, "I used to know it very well." She assumed reasonably that he had worked there once. A gardener maybe, groundskeeper, maintenance, something that would explain the intimacy in his eyes without explaining anything else. Then strange things began to happen. The estate's security guards, the same ones who waved cars through the gates with bored efficiency, started greeting Daniel with a small, respectful nod whenever he walked past the entrance on his evening walks. Walks Amara only later realized weren't aimless at all. One afternoon, an elderly groundskeeper trimming the hedges near the outer wall stopped what he was doing entirely, straightened his back, and removed his cap as Daniel passed. Amara, walking a few steps behind with the grocery bags, thought she'd imagined it. Daniel said nothing. A week after that, a black luxury SUV slowed to a stop beside them on the sidewalk. The driver stepped out, a man in a suit that cost more than Amara's monthly rent, and approached not her, but Daniel. "Sir," the driver said with a formality that made the hair on Amara's arms rise, "they're still waiting for your decision." Daniel's expression didn't change. "Not yet," he said, in the same calm voice he used to tell her breakfast was ready. The driver nodded once, got back in the car, and left as quickly as he'd come. Amara stood frozen on the sidewalk, grocery bags cutting into her fingers. "Who was that?" "Someone from my past," Daniel said, already walking again. She wanted to ask more. The words were right there, crowding her throat. But every time she tried, he found a way to turn the conversation gently elsewhere, toward her shift schedule, towards what she wanted for dinner, toward anything but himself. And something in his eyes told her that pushing wouldn't get her closer to the truth, only closer to losing whatever fragile trust had grown between them. Months passed, and Amara began to notice something else. Something quieter and stranger than any driver or any groundskeeper's bow. Daniel received almost no phone calls. No visitors ever came looking for him. No bank statements arrived in the mail. Not even the junk kind that follows everyone with a name and an address. No social media notifications lit up a phone he barely used. It was as if at some point before she'd met him on that broken bench in the rain, Daniel had deliberately erased himself from the world, scrubbed away every thread that might lead someone back to him. She started to wonder, in the quiet hours between shifts, whether she had married a ghost. Not the frightening kind, the kind made by grief or shame or something he wasn't ready to say out loud. She never stopped being kind to him. If anything, the mystery only deepened the strange, careful tenderness that had grown between them. Two people sharing a small apartment, a marriage of convenience slowly filling in with something neither of them had named yet. Then one morning, everything changed. Amara was at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, still in her scrubs from a shift that had ended 2 hours earlier, when she heard the sound of engines. Too many engines. Too smooth and too expensive for their narrow residential street. A black convoy of luxury vehicles pulled into the apartment compound, tires crunching over gravel that usually only held delivery trucks and the landlord's aging sedan. Men in tailored suits stepped out, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once had a door closed on them, and walked directly toward her building. The neighbors rushed to their windows. Children stopped playing in the courtyard, tugged back by mothers who sensed, correctly, that something enormous was happening. Even the landlord, the same man who had once told Amara her marriage would ruin her, came down the stairs 2 at a time, straightening his shirt as he went. One of the men, older, silver-haired, carrying himself like a man used to being obeyed, knocked on Amara's door. When Daniel opened it, the man did something Amara had never seen anyone do in her entire life. He bowed his head. "Mr. Daniel Sterling," he said, voice carrying easily into the small apartment and out into the hallway where half the building now stood listening. "The board has approved the transfer. The entire Maple Crest Estate is now legally, fully back under your control." The apartment went silent in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had stopped moving. Amara looked from the suited men to Daniel, to the estate visible just beyond the balcony doors. The same estate she had dreamed about as a girl leaning over that rail. The same estate Daniel had stared at every evening with that quiet, private familiarity she could never quite name. Her voice, when it finally came, barely worked at all. "What did he just say?" Daniel turned to her. He wore the same calm smile he'd worn the night she found him on that bench in the rain, the smile of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was finally allowed to set it down. "I was going to tell you," he said softly, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice shook just slightly at the edges. "I own the whole estate. It would take Amara weeks to piece together the rest." Not because Daniel refused to tell her. Once the truth was out, he told her everything. Sitting across from her at their same small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. He never drank, but because the truth was simply too large to fit into a single conversation. Daniel Sterling had been born into the Maple Crest fortune, the only son of a family that had built its wealth over 3 generations of careful, ruthless business. He had grown up behind those very gates, in one of the mansions Amara used to point out to her mother as a child, dreaming of a life that had, in fact, once belonged to the man now sitting across from her. 2 years before the rainstorm that brought them together, Daniel's father had died suddenly, and a cousin on the estate's governing board, a man Daniel had once trusted like a brother, had exploited a gap in the family trust to seize temporary control, freezing Daniel's accounts, revoking his access, and quietly spreading word through the family circle that Daniel had mismanaged the company and stepped away in disgrace. Daniel could have fought it in the courts immediately. He had the standing, the name, the eventual legal right, but something in him, grief for his father, exhaustion with a world that had only ever valued him for what he controlled, or perhaps simple curiosity about who he was without any of it, made him do something no one expected. He walked away. He let the lie stand. He wanted, he later told Amara, to know just once in his life whether anyone would treat him with kindness when he had absolutely nothing to offer them in return. For 2 years, while lawyers quietly built his case and the estate's board slowly turned against the cousin who had seized it, Daniel Sterling lived as a man with no name worth mentioning. He slept where he could. He was turned away from shelters. He sat on broken benches in the rain. And on one of those nights, a tired nurse with kind eyes and nothing to gain had stopped to ask if he was all right. "You never once asked me for anything," Daniel told her that afternoon at the kitchen table. "Not money, not answers, not even my last name until you needed it for the marriage papers. Everyone else in my life wanted something from me the moment they found out who I was. You wanted something from me before you ever knew." The neighborhood didn't laugh anymore. Within days, journalists and old family associates began appearing at the compound gates, and Amara found herself, almost overnight, being called things she never asked to be called: the woman who married a fortune, the wife of Daniel Sterling, the nurse who got lucky. None of it interested her nearly as much as one quiet question that kept her up at night: what happens now? She asked him directly 3 weeks after the convoy, sitting on that same narrow balcony where he used to stand and stare at everything he'd lost. You don't have to stay married to me, she said. You have your name back, your world back. You don't need an apartment with a stuck window anymore. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, looking not at the estate this time, but at her. I didn't marry you for the apartment, he said. You gave me that. I stayed married to you because for 2 years, you were the only real thing in my life. Everything else, the estate, the board, the name, I can get all of that back with paperwork. I can't get you back with paperwork. If you'll let me, I'd like to keep you anyway. Amara didn't answer right away. She thought about the balcony, about the girl she'd once been leaning over that rail, dreaming of a life behind those gates, never once imagining that life would come find her instead, soaked through and sitting on a broken bench, asking for nothing at all. Ask me properly this time, she finally said. Not because I needed to give you shelter, because you actually want to marry me. So he did. And this time when the wedding happened, modest by Daniel's insistence, held not at the estate but in the same small apartment where it all began, with Efema and the same elderly court clerk standing witness once more, the whole neighborhood came to watch. Not to laugh this time, to see with their own eyes that sometimes the woman everyone pities for giving too much is quietly, patiently, building the one thing money never could.